When I was a little kid, we came up to Mother's Day, and I knew that it was my responsibility to buy my mom a present. And so I went to the Five and Dime store, which is where little kids go when they need to buy presents for their parents because they don't have very much money. And I was trying to figure out what I could buy my mom for Mother's Day that would just help her understand how much I loved her, but also get me in her good graces for future opportunities in my family. And so I went up and down the aisles of the store, and I thought to myself, I probably should buy her some perfume. Now, this was back in the day when I didn't understand all the dynamics of buying perfume for your mom, because I thought that all that mattered was the way the bottle looked. And so I looked for the prettiest, cheapest bottle I could find, unsuspecting that if it was cheap, it wasn't probably going to have the smell or the fragrance that you might want. But when you're just a little kid, 7 years old, you don't think in those terms. And so you look for the prettiest bottle, you buy it, and you just take it home, give it to your mother for Mother's Day, and you don't think another thing about the fact that she's probably going to open it up. And then she's probably going to sprinkle it on the pulse point of her wrist. And then you're going to have to smell it for the rest of the day. Now, I didn't understand those dynamics, and unfortunately, my choice of bottle didn't match the fragrance I was looking for. And so I was forced to deal with that fragrance the rest of the day. Several years later, I unfortunately went shopping with Keisha when she was looking for fragrances. And I didn't understand the dynamics of how that worked when a husband and wife go shopping together for a fragrance. So we stopped at this counter where all these women hung out, and which was very awkward for me. I felt very awkward standing there with my wife at this counter, and we began to look through the fragrances. And what I didn't understand was if you choose to do that, you have to offer your pulse point for the smelling of the fragrances to make sure you chose just the right one. What I didn't anticipate, that is, if you did that for the rest of the day, you would smell like a woman. And so for the rest of the day, I tried the best I could possibly try to keep my pulse point out of the way of any person that I would come in contact with, because you don't want other people to think, as you meet them, interact with them during the day, that you smell like a woman. And so I've been very careful about avoiding this topic for several reasons until I came upon a story in the Bible that was all about fragrances. Now, I don't know about you, but I suppose many of us in this room, if we had to choose to give up one of the five senses, if we could only have four and we had to give up one, we probably wouldn't give up sight. We probably wouldn't give up touch. We probably wouldn't give up hearing. And we probably wouldn't give up taste. If we had one sense that we could part with, maybe it would be the sense of smell. And yet the problem with the sense of smell is it's used by people in our world to attract us and to pull us in to all kinds of situations. You get your car washed, and what they want to know when you go to purchase the car wash is if you would like a fragrance. You go to the store and you find all these people who are peddling samples of foods, and what they're trying to do when you walk in the store, they put the bakery at the front of the store. They put things that attract your sense of smell to pull you in to purchase things so that the store will succeed. And so fragrance is a large part of just life. And what's interesting about this story, it's a story about fragrances. And in the Old Testament, when God had them construct the tabernacle, he insisted on one thing. They would burn incense in the tabernacle. And it wasn't just any kind of incense. The incense had a formula that had to be adhered to because God wanted a certain scent, a certain fragrance, a certain aroma for people to smell when they walked in to the tabernacle. Now that's amazing to me, that the sense of smell means so much to God. And a matter of fact, when a person died in the Jewish culture, they anointed the body with fragrances to counteract the smell of death. And so when Jesus went to Bethany after his good friend Lazarus died, it'd been 4 days since they had anointed his body and put it in the tomb. So much so that when Jesus asked to be taken to the tomb and the stone rolled back, Martha reminded him that he had been dead for 4 days, and the odor was too much. The odor of death had overcome the fragrance of anointing. And so this morning, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the motivation, the heart that we have to give. And I want to talk about it in the context of this story. And I want to ask you this question. Why do you do what you do? What motivates you? Let's read in John chapter 12. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Now, Beth means house. So in Israel, when they name towns using the prefix Beth. For instance, Bethlehem means house of bread. Bethel means house of God. Bethany means house of misery. So Jesus goes to Bethany, which was a favorite place for Jesus to hang out. He had 3 special people that lived there, actually 4, that he used to hang out with a lot. Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Simon the leper. Now it's interesting that when they refer to Simon the leper, they call him Simon the leper, which means that he retained that title after he was healed. Now that's interesting that someone would want to be called Simon the leper after he wasn't a leper anymore. But Simon wanted everybody to remember that he wasn't a leper for one reason: Jesus Christ. Now Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were all single. They were not married. And Jesus loved to hang out at their place. And matter of fact, the last week that Jesus was alive on this earth, he would spend the night in Bethany and go into Jerusalem during the day. So he would spend the time in Jerusalem, and then he would come back to Mary and Martha's house in the evening, so he could sort of let down his hair. Well, it turns out that 6 days before all of this was going to go down, 6 days before the Passover, where Jesus was going to be killed, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, and Simon the leper decided they wanted to have a dinner for Jesus and all his entourage. So we're talking major bucks. And they evidently had it at the home of Simon the leper, and Mary and Martha and Lazarus went to share this time with Jesus and all his disciples. And it says something pretty interesting. It says that Martha served. Now, I don't know if you remember or not, but Mary and Martha had a little disagreement earlier in Jesus' ministry when Jesus was at their home and Martha was in the kitchen and Mary was listening to what Jesus was saying and Martha got hacked. And she goes to Jesus and tattles on her sister and says, Jesus, I am working feverishly to prepare a meal for you, and my sister is not helping. Would you please make her come in and help me with dinner? And Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you're so upset about many things, but Mary has chosen the important part. Now you fast forward it to this meal. And it says Martha is serving. But the difference is Martha is serving, but she's not upset anymore. Because Martha understands the whole point behind serving is serving Jesus and not being upset about it. So it says Martha is serving, and Lazarus, who has been dead and now is alive again because Jesus had called him back from the grave, he is one of the guests at the table. And all of a sudden, something happens. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, which came from the Himalayan mountains in India. It cost hundreds of dollars. It was pure nard, which means that it wasn't just oil with a few drops of nard to make it smell like nard, but it was pure, unadulterated nard. She took this jar of ointment and she anointed the feet of Jesus, wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. You know, one of the things that's important when we read God's word is to read it with our whole bodies. So if there's a way that you could put yourself in the room this morning and you could smell the aromas of the dinner, you could smell the fresh bread, and you could smell all the entrees, and you could put yourself in that room with the beautiful aroma of fragrances and aromas of a good cooked meal. And then on top of that, when Mary breaks open this jar of perfume and she begins to anoint the feet of Jesus, the entire room is filled with the fragrance of this perfume. A pound of nard. And all of a sudden, this aroma permeates the whole room. Now, why did Mary do that? Well, maybe she did it because of her brother Lazarus. Because she'd lost him. He was gone. And when Jesus showed up 4 days later, she told him, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus goes to the tomb and he calls Lazarus come forth, and Mary embraces her brother who had been dead for 4 days, and she is grateful for what Jesus has given her back. She probably had 2 jars of nard. She had used one for Lazarus, and she had one more for herself. But Lazarus was back from the dead. And she was so thankful and so grateful and so filled with love for Jesus that she tried to think of something she could do that would express her gratitude and her love for Jesus. And it's such an extravagant thing, but she thought to herself, I will take this precious ointment and I will anoint the feet of Jesus. And it was an act she couldn't hide because the aroma was so strong. The fragrance was so strong that everyone's attention was drawn to what she was doing. So she's at the feet of Jesus, and she's pouring this precious ointment on Jesus' feet. Ointment that could have lasted her for days and weeks and months and even years. And she watches that precious oil drip from the feet of Jesus onto the floor, and she wipes his feet with her hair. And everyone is pulled into this amazing moment, not knowing what to say. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11, Solomon writes these words, He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Money flows to what you're passionate about. You can find out about people by looking at where they spend their money. You can look at their checkbooks. You can look in their garages. You can look in the chest of drawers of their homes, and whatever they're passionate about, money flows to that, whatever it is. Mary's money flowed to Jesus. She was passionate about him. She loved him, and she wanted to extravagantly express her love towards him. So why do you do what you do? Number 2, why do you say what you say? It goes on, and this is what John writes. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, one of the motivations or one of the techniques they teach salesmen is you make your sales pitch and then you are silent. You put the pen on the piece of paper or contract you want signed. You put the pen on the contract. You lean back in your chair and you do not say anything. And you wait for the tyranny of silence to work. Because some people cannot stand silence. Mary hasn't said a word. She has just expressed her love. But Judas can't stand it. He has to say something. So why do you say what you say? Notice what Judas says. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Now that is a good question. That's a really good question. A matter of fact, what Judas is saying is this: what a terrible waste. What a terrible waste. This could be sold, and the money, it's a year's wages. It's 300 days of work. This could have been sold, and the money could have been given to the poor. This makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. And we deal with this all the time at Cornerstone. Because we send people on mission trips. And people say, that makes no sense. Why are you wasting so much money to send groups of people to the mission field when you could just send the money? It makes so much more sense. You can just send the money. They can do the work. They can have the people there pay each other folks there to do the work. And you can save the expense of travel, of all the accommodation you have to make. It makes more sense to send the money and stay home until you understand the purpose of what you're trying to do. Because when you sit across from a missionary who's lonely and hasn't been able to talk to anybody in his or her native tongue for months, they haven't been able to sing in English. They haven't been able to talk about things they need to talk about because they can't say the things they need to say in front of the locals because the locals wouldn't understand. And so finally, when they have a moment with people from their home country, people who speak English, they can finally talk about burdens and struggles they're having. They can finally share things they couldn't share with anybody else. And that is precious time that could never be bought with just sending a check. And so Judas asks a pretty good question. Why couldn't have this been sold and the money given to the poor? This makes no sense. But the good thing about this question that Judas asks is we wouldn't know how much the nard cost, but Judas had sized it up, as a good CFO does. He's a finance officer. He's in charge of the money bag of the disciples. And so it's his responsibility to scope things out to make sure he understands about cost effectiveness. He scopes things out. He looks at this jar of nard. He sizes it up and says, you know what? That's worth a year's wages. 300 denarii. And that money could have been spent a lot better than she's spending it. And matter of fact, Mark tells us in Mark chapter 14 that they don't just say this, but they scold her for it. They scold her. You shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be wasting that ointment. You shouldn't be anointing the feet of Jesus that way. This is a total waste of time. He wouldn't want it for himself. But then John goes on. And John says this. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put in it. Now we find out there's another motivation for Judas saying what looks like he was saying because he cared about poor people. The truth was, Judas didn't care about poor people at all. He just wanted the money to be put in the money bag because once it got into the money bag, Judas could help himself. And so he was disguising improper motives by saying the right thing and making it look like he was very compassionate about poor people, when the truth is he was taking and robbing from Jesus Christ himself. He was taking money that women and other people had donated to Jesus for his ministry, and he was dipping in the money bag, and he was using that money for himself. Because money flows to what you're passionate about. And when the money flowed into the money bag of Jesus, because people were passionate about Jesus and his ministry, the money flowed into the hands of Judas and into the money bag of Judas, because Judas' passion wasn't for Jesus, but for himself. And all that Judas cared about was himself. And Judas speaks up in this room, and he says, this makes no sense. And if we're honest, many of us, when we sit down to write our check to the church, many times we're tempted to say, this makes no sense. And it doesn't, unless your motivation is that you love Jesus and you want to extravagantly give to him. Point number 3. So when do you give what you give? Now Jesus speaks up. Judas has had his moment. Mary has had her moment. And now Jesus speaks. And he speaks into this event. And we're anxious to hear what Jesus has to say about it. Does Jesus think this is a waste? Does Jesus think this should have been sold and the money given to the poor? Is Jesus embarrassed by this? Does Jesus feel self-conscious about Mary's extravagance? What does Jesus say? And Jesus said, leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. Now, Mark writes about this in his gospel. And Mark's gospel was written from Peter's point of view. So Peter is in this moment. Peter is in the room. Peter sees what Mary does. Peter smells the fragrance there. So Peter tells Mark about this moment, and this is what Mark says. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? Let me tell you something before we go on. If you are generous, you open yourself up to criticism. It's just the way it works. Generous people are criticized. I remember when I was in Bible college, we had this lady, Mrs. Phillips, who purchased an organ for Ozark Christian College. And being the smart aleck freshman who thought he knew everything about spirituality and all that sort of thing, I thought to myself and said to some of my friends, what a waste. Why would you buy an organ when you could pay for scholarships for kids, when you could do all these other things? Why would you buy an organ for a Bible college? It makes no sense. And I thought I was so spiritual for criticizing Mrs. Phillips for doing that. Why would you buy an organ for a Bible college? Well, maybe it's because you want to bless people with worship and music. Maybe it's because you want people to be drawn into the presence of God. Maybe you want people to be caught up in the spirit of who God is, and the organ music can help you that. But you think to yourself, but organs aren't even used anymore. I think a lot of times when people are extravagant in giving to Jesus and giving to God, Jesus says, leave them alone. But Jesus said, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. Now, I don't know about you, but anytime Jesus uses the word beautiful, I better pay attention. Because when God calls something beautiful, it must be really beautiful. Because God makes beautiful things. He makes sunsets, he makes waterfalls, he makes flowers, he makes all these beautiful things. And when God says, now that is beautiful, I better pay attention to what that is. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Is one of the most beautiful compensations of life that no man can sincerely try to help another without helping himself." And Jesus goes on to say, For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her, just like we're doing today. Mary breaks a bottle of nard 2,000 years ago, and the aroma of it is in this room today. That's amazing. It's a beautiful thing. But what did Mary understand? Mary understood something that we need to understand. She only had this large of a window to do what she could do. 6 days before Passover, John says, and Mary realized she only had this amount of time to do what she wanted to do. And so she seized the moment. This is my moment, she thought to herself, and she was right. You know why she was right? Because when Jesus was crucified, and he died early, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus. They took the body down from the cross, they wrapped it in cloths, and they anointed it, and they put the body in the tomb. And when the ladies came to anoint the body of Jesus, they weren't able to anoint the body of Jesus because it was already gone on Sunday. And Mary had anointed the body of Jesus, and she's the only woman that got to anoint the body of Jesus before he died, because she had a window and she realized, I've only got this much time. And I need to do it now for later. I need to do it now for the future. And Jesus says she has done what she could now. And she did it for the future. And that's why these moments are so important. Why do you do what you do? Why do you say what you say? When do you give what you give? So last night, a group of the leaders of Cornerstone Christian Church met in the cafeteria. And they met for one reason, and that was to fill out their commitment cards ahead of time before we met today. Because you don't want people in leadership positions who don't lead by example. And so our leaders got together. They've been praying about these moments. They've been praying for you. They've been praying for themselves. They've been praying and asking God what God wanted them to do. And so we got to the time where it came to fill out these cards. And we together wrote down on the card our names. Some people don't want to write down their names, so some people were anonymous. But we don't care about that, because God says, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So if you want to be anonymous, that's totally great. So some of them were anonymous, some of them weren't, some of them wrote down their names, some of them didn't. We have Barnabas' name in the book of Acts because the people that wrote the book of Acts, Luke, wanted us to know that Barnabas did this. He sold his house for the whole church. And Luke wanted everybody to know that Barnabas did that. But some people, we don't know what they gave. And so these people filled out their cards. For the next 3 years, I'm going to give this much money. And next week, on October the 20th, I'm going to try to scrape together this much money as a first fruit for what I'm going to do for the next 3 years. We're not expecting all the money next week. That's just the first fruit offering. So we filled out our cards, turned them all in, and I said, okay, you're all dismissed. And they said, oh, well, we want to know how much it is. I said, well, you don't want to just go home? He said, no, we want to know how much it is. So we gave all the cards to Karen Webb And she got out her iPhone and she started dialing all these things up. And last night, the leadership of Cornerstone Christian Church, leading by example, pledged to give in the next 3 years $545,800. It's amazing. And today, we're asking you to join them. And I have no idea what God's going to do with the loaves and fish that we collect. But I'm convinced that God already has plans that he plans to accomplish with the monies that are given. So I want to just share my heart with you before we sing our invitation. I do not like spending pulpit time trying to twist people's arm to give money. And I don't want you to take this as that, because it is not. I sat down with my own kids, and I told them, I want you all to tithe, because I don't want you to miss the blessing that God has for your life. I don't want you to miss for God to show you over and over and over again that he is more than faithful. And I want you to experience that in your own marriages and in your own lives and in your work. I want you to experience that for yourself. And I want the same thing for you. And so I'm not asking, you know, that's the one thing that bothers me about these whole things is that people, it comes across as we want you to give the money to do this building thing. No, I want you to give the money to Jesus. That's what I want. And we'll just ask God to provide the building, because the church isn't a building. The church is people. And that's all that matters. But I just want all of us this morning to think why you do what you do. Money flows to passion. Number 2, why you say what you say. And number 3, when do you give what you give? And I don't know the answer. You're the only one that does. And so I'm just asking you this morning to pray that God would speak to you. If you're visiting this morning, I know that God wants you to hear this, but we don't expect you to give to what we're doing, although we certainly won't turn it away if you want to. But number 1, I know that Jesus wants you to give your life to him. Number 2, I know that if you're looking for a church home, we would like you to join with us at Cornerstone Christian Church. And number 3, if you're struggling this morning with your passions and your money's flowing places maybe it shouldn't, maybe we need to pray that God would change your heart and change your passions so that it is congruent with your belief in Jesus Christ. That's what matters. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing our hymn of invitation, and then I'm going to ask you to sit down, and then as a total church, we're all going to go through this commitment together as a church family, and then we're going to be done. And we'll pray that God will do what only he can do. Let me pray, and then we'll sing. Our Father.